Hello from the Authors Guild Foundation. My name's Johnny. We're happy to be here today hosting today's talk with collaboration from ALTA, the American Literary Translators Association. My former coworker, Katrine Ogard-Jensen, recently became executive director at ALTA. Very happy for her and for ALTA to have her. And we're excited to work with them on advocacy issues and programming like this. Today is Path to Publication for Literary Translation. This is in our ongoing series, Business Boot Camps for Writers, where we cover general topics about getting published and managing a career, and more specific topics like this. Obviously, literary translation has many foibles of its own. Thank you to the National Endowment for the Arts and our donors whose support allows us to produce a robust lineup of free public educational programming for writers anywhere who are interested. To our audience, thanks for being here and for the questions you submitted in advance. We've combed through those, and those are shaping today's talk. We'll also have some time for Q&A at the end, so you can pop more questions in the Q&A box there. And now I'm happy to introduce our moderator, Chenxin Jiang. She translates from Italian, German, and Chinese. Her most recent translation is For Now I Am Sitting Here Growing Transparent by Yao Qing with Zephyr Press. She is also president of the board for the American Literary Translators Association. Welcome our panel, and Chenxin, I'll leave it to you now. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you to Johnny and the Authors Guild for putting this on, and to all of you in the audience for turning up, and to all of the panelists for being here. It's always great to have, it's like great energy in a Zoom room for like a bunch of people turning up to talk about a subject that matters a lot to all of us. I'm gonna essentially do some like quick introductions, and then jump right into it. I think there were a few questions that so we chatted about it in advance, and there are a few questions that we definitely want to cover just to give people a sort of like broad overview of the path to publication for translators, and then we also got a bunch of questions from folks that were pre-submitted at registration, so we'll cover some of those as well, and then we'll try and leave some time for questions that we can sort of like just take from the audience. Anyway, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Okay, and then I'm just gonna read people's bios in the order that they appear on my Zoom screen. So, Sarah Gale is an editor and publicist at Archipelago Books, where she greatly enjoys working on books translated from a large range of languages, including Kurdish, Portuguese, French, Slovenian, and Danish. Not on the bio, but I can't resist pointing out that last year she shared the very first ALTA First Translation Prize for publishing The Enlightenment of Katsuo Nakamatsu, which by Augusto Higashiro, translated by Jennifer Shu, for whom it was her debut translation. Okay, Chad Post is the publisher of Open Letter Books, and editorial director at Dalkey Archive Press. He does the 3% podcast, the 2-month review podcast, Mining the Dalkey Archive Substack and podcast, and he also teaches at the University of Rochester. Kristen Vida Alfaro is the publisher and executive director of Tilted Axis Press. She's also a writer. She previously led labor and anti-racist organizing. Wow, I should talk slower. Okay, talk slower. At the Barbican. And she's based in London, and she's appeared in all manner of cool places for her work with Tilted Axis. Alexa Frank is an editor at HarperVia, which is an imprint of HarperCollins. She is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and the Fulbright program, and she has edited titles such as Tomihiko Morimi's The Tatami Galaxy, which was shortlisted for the 2023 Penn Translation Prize, and Lin Yihan's Fang Xiqi's First Love Paradise, which was shortlisted for the Bai Fangshao Books Prize. Yeah, that's right. And she also translates Japanese manga. Here we go. Okay, so maybe just to start out with, this is a question that we think, possibly at least a few people in the audience have turned up to hear the answer to, which is like, how does an aspiring translator break in? And, especially for a sort of Authors Guild audience, do you think it matters if, the translator already has a publication record as a writer? And how can you make yourself stand out and put yourself on the map as a person of interest?
Are you looking at me to answer this one
Yeah,
first?
yeah,
Okay.
sure. Anyway.
This could be taken in like a very broad way. So I'll just say a couple things and then hopefully we can tease some of this out later on. In terms of Open Letter and Delicate Archive before that, I've worked with a wide range of translators, people who are incredibly established to people who are like truly just breaking in. And as part of the University of Rochester, we run a master's program in literary translation. So through that, I've worked with a lot more students who are either trying to become translators, many of whom have, others who work through and get a project done, and that's pretty much kind of where they end. Over time, a couple things that have stood out to help people break in. One is to be very passionate about a project that you have in mind. To be able to have be fully invested in that and wanting to do the best that you can by that project is incredibly important because it does seep through in what you present and how you talk about the work and what you're trying to do. So that's really key. And one thing worth noting for anyone looking to get into translation is you absolutely need to make sure that the rights are available before you get too far along in your project. This is something that's a big pitfall where people have gone along and translated a full book and then found out that the rights were sold. There's a different translator already working on it. There's nothing they can do. So be sure and do that. And in that process, one good tip is if the author that you've identified a book, you really want to work on this book, you want to do a sample, you want to see if you can get it published. If that author has a agent, be sure and talk to and work with that agent as much as possible. An agent can help bring your book to a wider number of publishers, a wider space. That's very important. And this sort of ties into the second point. I don't want to talk too much right here off the jump, but the second point is that a lot of this business is still like kind of a personal connection thing. And with a lot of presses that are doing translations tend to be, with the exception of like HarperVia and a handful of others, a lot of them are smaller presses, independent, nonprofit, university based. They're much smaller and tend to have a wider like range of what they'll accept as submissions. So certain bigger presses like Penguin Random House, you need to be agented to have a book submitted to the editors. That's not the case with Open Letter. I don't believe that's the case with Archipelago or Tilted Access. You're able to like submit things. And in that case, when you're submitting directly, there is something about a personal relationship that helps. So the chances that if you have the opportunity to attend things like this, to do things like the American Literary Translators Association had a pitch sessions, I think they have them twice throughout the year, but where you can pitch an editor the work, the sample that you're working on, the books that you're working on. That's really important. There's also something called Translation Breadloaf, where I've met one of our big translators from Spanish, Katie Whittemore. I met her there, and she's gone on to do like 10 books for us over the course of her career. And part of it was that we connected over a certain number of literary authors, and then the relationship really worked in terms of the editing process, which I'm sure we'll talk about later too. But being able to make those connections, going to the London Book Fair where they have the translators, what's it called? Forum? No, that's wrong. The Translator Center at the London Book Fair. You're going to meet a lot of people, meet a lot of potential mentors, be able to interact with people in a way that's not just like, hi, I'm pitching you my book. Look at this. But then, of course, within to be able to stand out and get started, one of the big things is the quality, obviously. The better your sample translation, the better off you will fare. And as part of that, I always recommend just reading a lot of translations and books written in English and getting a better sense for how things can be done and can be written. That's really important. And then I'm sure we'll talk about this, but your cover letter, being able to distinguish why a book is important now, like why this book today, because as translation publishers, we at least Open Letter is looking for books from like 1920 through 2025. There's no like specific moment that we're looking for. There's not one thing that we're trying to find. So you could be pitching something that's quite old and making a case for it in the moment, in the email, in the cover letter, in whatever you provide, as to like why should I pay attention to this book today, is sort of an important thing. So being able to frame that and talk about that is really important. But those are just some big broad outlines. Again, I don't want to talk too much at the beginning of this, so that's all I'll say for now.
Yeah, yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Chad. Kristen.
Hi, yes, I just wanted to add a couple of things. Everything Chad said is absolutely true. But also there's another like equivalent of ALTA, the British Center for almost equivalent, but British Center for Literary Translation. They have a summer school, which has been incredible. And depending on the languages that you translate from, like, for example, the Singapore Art Council, I believe it is, they also have mentorship programs, and where they pair, for example, a translator that we work with, Jeremy Tiang, with as a mentor for other translators, and that relationship can be absolutely invaluable depending on how you go about it and how you use it. And they give you funding to travel to the London Book Fair. So I just also wanted to address that maybe some people don't have the money to attend any of these things. So what do? The internet is your best friend in that case. Reach out to people through social media. Translators are very friendly, and you know, the translators that we work with and that I'm good friends with, they love their community in like particular cities. There are translators of color communities, there are unions. Find your people. So I really think that community should be emphasized within how do you burst through in terms of translation, and they can help you find the right publisher. And that's the other thing that I just wanted to quickly add, is that maybe one publisher is better for you than the other. So research the publishers and see which one that your book may fit. And also, yeah, just as Chad said, work on something that you love, because you're going to spend a lot of time on it, and then you're going to get edits for it, and it's not going to be easy, the whole process. So make sure there's a reason you're there and you want to stick it out and you believe in.
Yeah, fantastic. That's just which is actually a really good segue into our next question, which is a question that's all around sort of like, how do you typically like sort of like choose works to be published? How do you receive pitches? How, and yeah, like just sort of like how does this whole process work for you? Anyone really? No, not like also it's a Zoom room, so I can't even like gesture at a person.
I think obviously we probably all have our own kind of process, but it's connected to what Kristen and Chad already said. But I think in the process of receiving a pitch, when it's very clear that the person really loves the work, that's just like immediately very engaging. And I think sometimes the topicality of a work, or like the question of why now, can kind of overshadow that, and it can sort of feel like I would just kind of tread lightly in pitching that way, because on the one hand it's very important, but on the other hand, a work that is really speaks to you as a translator is probably like a good enough reason to be pitching it. And I think sometimes if something is like feels too topical, it feels like maybe, I don't know, it gets confused like what the reason is that it's being pitched. And so yeah, I think the pitch, like a brief pitch that gives kind of like historical context, and maybe like the story of how you came across the work, is a really good kind of entry point to the work.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And is also actually one of the points of a panel like this, right? Is like you're all at different presses looking for different things. And it's nice to get people's views like in stereo, as it were, from different points of view, because, like everyone's going to be looking for something very slightly different.
That's the one thing I was going to add to that, is knowing who you're pitching to is really important. So like what I'd be looking for versus what Archipelago is looking for versus Tilted Access versus HarperVia may be quite different. Like if we're focused on very like more experimental, structurally experimental novels, things like that, that's one thing. And versus like from different languages, different parts of the world being an emphasis at different presses, everything's a little bit different. And I can't emphasize enough that if you send in a cover letter that makes it clear that you have no idea what we've ever published, I will very quickly not pay attention to that, unfortunately. It's very important to like at least frame within some idea, some general idea, that you know who you're sending your manuscript to and kind of why within that.
Yeah. Totally fair. And to that point, actually, could maybe, I mean, at least one or two of you, or everyone, if you like, talk a little bit about like what your press is looking for and what you're looking for in translations. And I think that will also help people to get a sense of, sort of the variety of presses and editors represented here.
I'm happy to jump in here. So, of course, I work for HarperCollins, which is a big corporation. It's the second biggest publishing house in the States. So that does kind of change a little bit of the vision and maybe what we're looking to publish. But I guess I can really only speak for myself and my own tastes, honestly. And, I'm very passionate about the endeavor of translation and literature. So I am not necessarily, even though I work for a very commercially focused house, I am also very interested in taking chances on things that maybe even some smaller presses would be a little bit more hesitant about. I translate Japanese manga, which is a little bit outside of the world of literary translation, but I think it does actually color a little bit of, I guess, my own risk-taking in-house. I think, like, for me as an editor, my tastes do run a little bit literary. I like things that maybe have like a bit of an edge, but also a bit of a sense of humor. I also am kind of embrace a genre work where I feel like on the line level it's strong. I don't know. I guess my taste does kind of run the gamut. I just also wanted to kind of jump in about sort of like the breaking in question that you posed earlier about kind of like how translators maybe have more of the go ahead when contacting editors at smaller presses. Again, I can only really speak for HarperVia and myself, but I'm very game and, open when translators do contact me out of the blue. I've been in your chair. I think it's like a scary process. And so when people actually do kind of say, hey, you don't have any idea who I am, it's like, okay, great. Well, now I do. So I just want to encourage those who might be attending. Don't contact me if you don't have anything just yet. But if you do, when you do, if you just want to say a hello, like I do, treasure that and keep that in mind for future projects. And I'm always happy to chat. So yeah.
Yeah, and Alexa totally has a track record of like debut translations, right? So, for instance, it's going to be embarrassing if I get it wrong, but presumably Jenna Tang's Linear Handbook is a debut. Is that right?
That's correct. And so Jenna was someone I connected through the ALTA pitch sessions, and I go to those every single year because I love connecting with new translators, and I'm also really invested in not just hiring the same names that we see all the time. Not that those names aren't great, and I love, those people work for a reason, but I think there's just so many people who want to get into literary translation, and I think it's important to make more space at the table. So that's something as an editor too that I'm really passionate about.
Amazing. Okay, and then one other, actually, Kristen, maybe you could talk about like what Tilted Axis is looking for and what you're looking for in a translation.
Sure. So it's we've changed over the years. We sort of started as in Asian language focused press that, because it didn't exist at the time in 2015 when Deborah Smith started this press alongside Simon Collinson and Sarah Shin. Just that it wasn't available. Korean translation, South Asian translation. So that was the remit. Over the years, I have changed it to kind of open it up a little bit more. And what it's called now is Translating Waters. And what we wanted to do was sort of take similar ideas from the original remit, but ensure that we focus on the fact that all sorts of languages are spoken in different parts of the world through colonial structures. Language moves, people move, why they move and how they move is really important to discuss and open up further than, translating within or understanding translation through land borders and languages in that sense. So now we're publishing literature from Latin America, and that we will be publishing a Spanish translation in the autumn, and that's going to be our first Spanish translation. But it is, it's a book by an Afro-Latin author, and that's what we're most interested in. So again, it goes back to what do we not hear from? Who do we not hear from? What are the stories that, that need to be translated. So in that sense, like working class, queer, feminist, we're all, that's kind of the basis and structure of what we publish and why. And then in terms of my own tastes, like I lean a lot towards the experimental, and I love like writing that's raw and that's emotive. Like I want to submit to something or dissolve in something. I want it to linger. And so those are the kinds of experiences that I might be looking for in a manuscript. And then quickly, I just wanted to say that, small presses are small teams, so it takes forever to get through things. And though we want open submissions, we simply don't have the capacity. And I don't quite know how to solve this problem. I don't know if anyone else can speak to that, but that's just to say, if we don't get back to you, there are reasons, and we try. Is the thing.
I'm honestly really enjoying how the like liquid metaphor that you started with, translating waters is like carrying all the way over into your like enjoyment of a work and dissolving in it. So anyway, yeah, really helpful. Okay, and then maybe one more question along these lines. How often does someone pitch something to you? Anybody really, where like you read it and then as Chad was saying earlier, you're like, oh, this is not for me, but it could be for X. Like, do you sometimes see people's works and then think like, oh, they should really have gone there? Do you tell them that? Like, what do you normally say to translators in that case? Oh, don't know.
You look like you're going to jump in. You go. Oh, well, I'll answer and then I'll let you go. But yeah, I do. If there's something like, especially during the pitch sessions, or if they're in a conversation, it can be like, that doesn't necessarily sound like us. There's someone asked a question I just answered about like, don't you want to help presses expand? They're not looking for the same book all the time. We're doing 10 books a year. So even though I would consider our editorial vision to be sort of broad, we do nonfiction stuff, poetry, and mostly novels and mostly literary fiction. Within the aesthetic, I know that it's pretty small compared to like what you would see it from a Penguin Random House or HarperCollins, for instance. However, like if like we don't do kids books, which I know this is another question, but Archipelago does do kids books. So if you pitch a kids book to us, that's not going to expand our vision. We're just not going to do it. But we don't do a lot of family sagas because they're not of great interest to me. But if you did have one that was like, structurally really interesting, stylistically doing something unique that sets it apart, yeah, sure, we will consider that and look at it. If you send one that's just like traditional, straightforward, I might be like, no, this isn't for us, but you might want to try this particular publisher or editor. It feels more of a vibe with them, and like at least point people in the right direction. There's no reason not to like work together on this. And it's not, there is a competitive aspect to publishing, but it doesn't have to be like so like cutthroat. And when there's someone submitting something to us that's not quite right or that we couldn't get to in like 5 years, then I'd be happy to see that person publish it elsewhere and get treated with like the respect that they deserve and give that book a shot.
The more translations, the better.
Yes. Okay, depending on whether anyone else is going to jump in here, I think our next two questions are, Sarah, I'm going to ask you about your editorial process. Alexa, I'm going to ask you about your own translation practice, and then there are also some pre-submitted questions. Okay, so and anyone else should jump in on the editorial process question as well. But then earlier, right before this, and we were chatting in the Zoom green room, one of the things that we mentioned, Sarah, is that you often work with languages that you don't know well or at all. What does your editorial process look like? And sort of, let's say if I were like a first-time translator, like coming to this process, like what should I expect?
Yeah, I'm learning German, but I don't speak any other language. So it's a very different process than if I were, translating from Spanish or working with a translator from Spanish and spoke the language or something like that. The process is pretty simple. Once I have the manuscript from the translator, I just do a pass of it. I go through the Word document and add in comments and suggestions and questions. And then send that on either to a colleague or just back to the translator. And then the translator can go through and respond to my notes. And then sometimes we'll do another pass with another editor. We're 5 people in total, but it's kind of 3 of us are editing, and we share projects kind of organically depending on how the book was acquired or how our interests or whatever it is. Yeah, and so on the English side, I'm mainly just feeling what the sentences are like and trying to listen to the voice and respond in a way that kind of like gives the book just a little bit more, I don't know, strength if it needs it. And there are some times where I read a translation and there are very few edits, but more often than not, there's things to tinker with like along the way. Or even just questions of like, what is this, what is this the word we want to use here? What is it? Can we look back at the original language here? And then in some cases, we have also brought in another translator to kind of like go through and look at the text alongside the original. This is like a little bit less frequent, but sometimes with an experimental book or a book that is difficult to translate for whatever reason, it's nice to have like another set of eyes.
Can you tell me how
Yeah.
often you're surprised? Because I mean, surely by the time a book gets all the way through to editorial, like you know what the book is about, quote unquote about, right? Like you've seen like a synopsis, you've probably like read a little sample. Like how often do you get it and you're like, whoa, this is not the book I thought it was, versus like, oh well, like this is more, like this is along the lines that I think I thought it was going to go along, I just need some work for some reason.
How often? I mean, I think this kind of points back to the question of what like what we look for when we're trying to publish something, because I feel like one of the things that's really important to me and one of the like biggest challenges of not speaking languages is knowing what the shape of the book is or like what form it takes. And I want to be surprised in a lot of ways by what happens in the book, just as anybody wants to be surprised when they're reading it, because ultimately I am just reading it for the first time in English. So it's better when it's a surprise, I think, than when the book is like just like kind of patly what I was presented. But of course, yeah, there's sometimes surprises. You can get a book and there's, I don't know, elements that are difficult in terms of like gender or race or that it's an older text and you're working with a different cultural context, and that's then kind of a question how much you want to work with the translator to either like note that this is an issue and just keep it as it is. Like I'm working on a book now where it's a wonderful book, but some of the gender dynamics are just frustrating at times. And I think it's always the little moment of question of, do I try to change this or do I just kind of need to keep it as it is because this is what the author wrote in the 70s? Yeah, so there are definitely surprises sometimes, but you kind of just work with the text as it is.
Yep, makes sense. Yeah, super exciting to get a little bit more of a glimpse into. And then Alexa, from the other side of the process, could you talk a little bit more about sort of like how you got into translating manga and what that sort of whole creative process is like for you?
Sure. So, I guess I'm part of the generation that grew up with manga in the States, well, younger millennial or whatever you want to call it. But yeah, so I studied translation at Iowa. So I wasn't there for translation, but they have a really strong literary translation program, and I just happened to take some translation workshops. I had studied Japanese since I was 13 years old, and then at undergrad I had also studied Japanese, so it's just kind of been a consistent through line throughout my life. But at Iowa, I kind of was thinking about, well, what if I could do my own translations? And of course, I thought of manga just because I enjoy reading it so much. And I think for Japanese translators, it's definitely, one of the pockets of literature where the work is consistent. It's a really big market now, and it's growing, consistently. So after I graduated from Iowa, I went to Tokyo on a Fulbright fellowship, and I happened to meet a translator who did some work for Kodansha, which is a big Japanese publisher. And I was able to get like a little bit of work from that person. It was like not for manga at all. I think my first like translation work was like it's for like a Japanese fried chicken book, which was, very fun, but not necessarily what I wanted to do. But funnily enough, I guess as the pandemic was starting to ramp up, I had to leave Japan and go back to America because of that. So my year in Japan turned into 6 months. But then someone from this Canadian publisher, Drawn and Quarterly, they're an independent comics publisher, but they have an amazing catalog. Definitely a lot of award recognition. I had been put in touch with them through this translator named Anne Ishii, and I met her when I was in college, and she had introduced me to this person at Drawn and Quarterly. Nothing really happened from that introduction until maybe like 4 years later, and they just kind of thought of me. And I think the reason they thought of me is because I sent them an email. They were putting out this really great book by like a Japanese woman manga artist that, was kind of like undersung. And I was like, that's great, but why didn't they get like a woman translator to do it? So I sent them an email being like, I'm really excited about this, but like, what is up with that? And then they're like, wow, it was kind of ballsy of you to do that. Would you like to translate this for us? That so that kind of like and it was like an email I sent like at 5 a.m. Japan time. I don't know. I was like in a weird headspace, obviously, but it turned out into a job opportunity for me and something that I've continued to do even as an editor at HarperCollins. And I think it informs my editorial process a lot because Japanese manga translation, it's not necessarily a collaboration. So in manga, a lot of the time, because like a lot of Japanese manga translators are not necessarily effective. You take a translation test, but that doesn't mean that's not like a writing test. It's just like, are you understanding what you're reading? And that doesn't mean you're necessarily an effective writer of English, which is something that I think in translation should be paramount. So I quickly learned that a lot of manga, they hire adaptation writers who basically rewrite your script from the ground up because they just kind of assume that manga translators can't write. So of course, this is another thing that just like deeply incensed me, but now I don't do as much of that kind of manga work. I work more with Drawn and Quarterly or New York Review of Books, their comics line, where it really does kind of mirror the literary translation process that I'm used to at HarperCollins, where you feel like you're all on the same team working towards the best version of that product. And, again, the writing skills are valued. So, when I work on a manga project, I often think about like, what am I doing right and wrong as an editor? Like, for example, when I translate something, I really abuse the Microsoft Word's comments section. I give them 4,000 alternatives, and some editors really do not like that. But a lot of the editors that I work with now really embrace that kind of neurotic quality of like, just, I'm kind of acting as an editor for them because I'll just be like, oh, here's a more literal read, here's a less literal read. And, again, I think at me as an editor, when I see like translators kind of almost put an editor cap on, in the drafting process, I do appreciate that because I feel like they're thinking, really, they're really considering the text on a sentence level. And I think that's important for the art of translation. Again, I care about the writing more than anything. I am even generous towards like, you make a mistake, I feel like that just happens and, it can be remedied in a reprint. So, I think like I continue to translate just because I feel like it makes me a better editor, it makes me a better writer, and I think it also makes me a more compassionate collaborator when I do edit my own books at Harper. So yeah.
Amazing. Yeah. Yeah, and actually I'm doing that for the first time. Have I ever done this for a book? I don't think I've ever done this for a book. But anyway, I'm working on a book right now that's a translation from Chinese with an editor who doesn't speak Chinese. And I had sent her like a complete first draft. But then But then in the back and forth, at one point, I was like, do you know what? How about I also send you a version with comments, and where obviously the comments have to make the translation problems clear to somebody who doesn't have Chinese, because it would be really nice to have a bit of a back and forth about this, and I would quite like it. Yeah, so channeling a little bit of that, Alexa, like you said. Okay, I think maybe um, uh, let's. Oh, I don't think we're going to be able to get through all the questions in the chat live, that's for sure. Um, is it okay if I like try and answer a couple of the questions in the chat live, and then we should get to the like pre-submitted questions as well. And then I'm just starting at the very top, which I know actually, should I start at the very bottom? Because that must be like the earlier questions, right?
The
Okay.
question from Deb actually ties into one of the things we were going to, Deborah,
Okay, great.
yeah, we were going to talk about. So that might be.
Oh yeah, okay. Well, maybe let's go there actually, which is just a really topical question. Loads of people have heard about the sort of like cancelled NEA grants that people found out about. I don't know. It's felt like an age since then, so I could not tell you if it was like 2 days ago or 2 weeks ago or 2 months ago, but actually very recently, and how translation publishers are impacted. Chad, do you want to go ahead?
I'll jump in on this one for a second, since oddly enough, I think I was one of the very first publishing people to get the email. I was waiting. This is in every article that I've been interviewed for, so I'm not embarrassed about saying anymore. But I was waiting to get in to watch Thunderbolts, and the doors were locked because I was there early. So I was flipping through my email and got this thing saying your award had been withdrawn. You have until the end of May to request it. For us, for Open Letter and for the University of Rochester, this didn't mean much because we had already fulfilled the grant obligations. We were putting in the request at that time. Nothing essentially changed. What this does, and to speak to this, I did end up getting this was 2 weeks ago exactly, and getting very enthusiastic and deeply invested in creating a lot of materials about this and around it. So there are 3 podcasts that I did. One that's a history of the NEA and the attacks on it and what its funding was for and where it started from. Scripted, very well put together. And then one that's a conversation with Two Lines, the Community for Literary Magazines and Presses, and with Transit Books about the impact of just losing these grants. And then a third one with Lissy Jaquette from formerly of ALTA and now part of Words Without Borders, and with Hillary Plum, who works for the Cleveland State University Poetry Center and various other presses, about how to talk about nonprofit publishing and the impact of like how do you create the desire for people to fund you on a larger level, because essentially we're all going to be looking to replace this funding. NEA funding is very essential to a lot of presses, especially magazines, but it is modest. It's always been relatively modest, which is one of the anger points related to the Elon Musk government idea of like you're eliminating nothing. You're not saving money by eliminating the NEA on any scale whatsoever. So it feels a little vindictive and mean. But in terms of your question about like what a translator should do and what we'll be doing, I know that a lot of presses will be kind of refocusing on, A, can we raise money to replace the NEA? B, when we look to do a book, is there funding available for that book separate from what we may have expected? Like we would do books that were from countries that did not have translation grants and put those into our NEA grant. That's going to be a problem now, right? So if you are a translator and you do know that there is funding available for your project, definitely mention that in the cover letter. That is important, even though I mean, I think everyone would say that we're going to make our decisions based on the quality of the text and how it fits with our list and like all of those kind of motivations. It doesn't hurt to know, oh, okay, so part of the cost of this will be subsidized in this particular way, or could be. It'll impact everything, but I think that there's routes that we can make come out better from this in the end, and more independent. But I think it'll take some work on collaborating between nonprofit presses and really like focusing our messaging.
Yeah, makes sense. And Kristen, I know you had something to add from the sort of UK perspective as well.
Just that, it's not quite as dramatic as the removal of the NEA funding, but it is happening in the UK. So a lot of small presses get their funding from Arts Council England. And recently, Tilted Access included, we didn't get our project funding that we had submitted for, and neither did 4 other presses that had applied. And this kind of project funding is continual. There's no kind of date. So essentially we have to go back and then apply again. And it's so much work for small presses with, you know, how many people are there. So it's just a really difficult landscape for nonprofits. And then yeah, that's basically the British side. You do have specific translation grants that, like English Pen, are wonderful. And you know, if you translate from South Asian languages, SALT and English Pen, that collaboration is amazing. But they only cover the translation. So what about overheads? What about the printing and production? So all of these kind of other expenses are what composes the book. And that's where these funding like NEA or the Arts Council England help.
Yeah. Yeah, makes loads of sense. Um, Another question for, sorry, Chad, you were going to say something.
I'm tying in one of your questions and
Go for it.
replying to Kristen. Kristen, you've mentioned, I think, twice that we are very small presses, generally speaking, that there are very few employees. Someone mentioned what not to do in the questions, I believe, somewhere in here. One of the things related to that is just keep in mind that, like, literally, like right now, Open Letter has 2 employees and really, truly, like 1.5. So, like, when we get submissions and whatnot, it's going to take a while. Feel free to follow up, but like, just understand there are like a lot of pieces to bringing out any particular book that take up quite a lot of time. So we don't always have the time to just be able to reply to everything. It's not for lack of like quality. It's just literally like this is a pretty grind you to the core sort of job in which there's not really a lot of time off or like time spent away from like thinking about or working on these publications. So if things are taking a while, just understand it's not out of spite, it's just out of lack of resources.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I was wondering also sort of on this point, whether some of you could speak to the question that Sawad posted in the chat, which was what would you like to see change in the oh shoot, where did I put it? The translation world, the book market, et cetera, except for the question of, you know, and not like more consistent, dependable funding, because that's certainly a thing we would all like to see change. So yeah, what would you like to be different? Anyone? It's kind of a hard question, that's true, but I'm also very curious about the answer.
Well, I think that translators need to be paid better. You know, I would like to pay more to translators. I think the reality of independent small presses in the UK is very difficult, but you know, translators, I mean, there are bigger presses that publish translated literature, and I think yeah, that better pay. I know it's not exactly fun, like what Sawad said, you know, we shouldn't talk about or other than, but paying people what they're worth as translators, even but also as publishers, is important. Um, that's one thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Everything I want to say is super systematic. So I don't know that it's even applicable at all, but like, balancing the field a little bit so that our books have as much of a shot as books coming from like a big corporate press would be wonderful. But that requires like, you know, changing the way that books are discovered, changing the way that they're talked about through like the lack of book reviews, altering the influence of like marketing co-op money. All those kind of things are like too pie in the sky to really be applicable within this particular question. And yet, like, there's got to be something for the presses that are like trying to do this on this level to find a better way to relate to our audience and have a more direct conversation with our audience and be able to encourage that without being totally mediated by, I don't know, there's the big corporation you might have heard of named Amazon that deals a lot with this kind of stuff. So the more that we'd have connections and be able to foster a larger readership for translations, the better. But there's no one way to fix that. It's like a huge, systematic problem. But that's my dream.
I think I agree that a lot of my issues are more systemic and not something like a translator could endeavor to change, but maybe within, I guess, the publication process itself, I feel like there's just a long ways to go to destigmatize reading and translation. I think just a lot of readers just genuinely don't understand translation as an art form, even if they read in translation they seem to not understand that it is a translation. And I remember the New York Times put out this like entire issue about translation, and it's never a good time reading the New York Times comments, but I was really like blown away about like how ignorant some of the comments were. And I was like, wow, there's just so much more work we need to be done so that people are embracing like so many other countries around the world where there's just not this wall of like, oh, this book wasn't actually written by this person, then I don't want to read it. I think it's just a genuine lack of education about what translation entails. But also, I would like, from small presses to big corporations such as HarperCollins to also just take more chances on marketing books that aren't just like the cozy fiction and translation that we're seeing proliferation in now. There are books that are huge in their countries for a reason, and they don't just fit like the neat boxes that I feel like our sales teams are more comfortable supporting. And so, within house too, especially on the corporate end, I just want sales to kind of see the bigger picture and be more open-minded. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, I don't know if Sarah's got one on this, but in any case, I think there's a question that's been asked several times over in the chat, which is some version of, like I'm an author and I have been published in English or I have been published in the US, and I'm curious about how to, how to get my book translated into other languages or sort of get my book noticed by sort of publishers or translators from elsewhere. So do any of you have any sort of advice or thoughts on that?
Well, if you are published in the US or Canada, or ask your publisher, because they might know, they might be trying to sell rights for other titles. If your author works for an agent, that's also another route. But one of the things that we try to do at Tilted Access is connect with other publishers in other places of the languages that we publish. So for example, Southeast Asia, we do a lot of collaborations. We have relationships with publishers in South Asia. So your publisher probably has some sort of connection that they could help you make, and also other translators.
I also wonder if if it could work to think about writers that you admire in your original language and then see who they were translated by in the language that you're hoping to be translated into, and reaching out to that person and introducing yourself and sharing your work is maybe a path. I don't know, because I've never had this problem myself, but
Amazing. And then also a quick follow-up on a question that we had earlier. What are good ways of supporting the presses that have been affected by the NEA news or affected by these other cuts that you're mentioning as well, like with Arts Council England and elsewhere? Asking on behalf of a literary agency, so that's cool.
Buy books, talk about them, share it on social media, review books.
yeah, all of those things. Yeah. And talking about books to friends. I think obviously donating, there's lots of things you can do monetarily that are kind of obvious, but just spreading the word, talking to your booksellers at your local independent bookstore about the books that you want to see in the bookstore is really helpful too.
All of that, and ordering the books directly from the publisher is a better game for us. We have a subscription model. I think Archipelago, you have a subscription as well. So, and I don't know if Tilted Access does because no, so yes. Okay. So like the subscription models work really well because then we have some sort of sense of like how many copies of a book are going to go out on day one, won't be returned. It's also money that can be invested. That's a great way to support if you're sort of like, if you're a, if you're an eccentric billionaire and want to give a little money, little change to these presses, you could change the whole landscape like that. It truly would not take a lot of money to really alter the literary landscape of American and British publishing totally. So if you got some cash just sitting around, and you're sick of the stock market and tariffs, come talk to me. I've got you. But if you're short of that, buying stuff directly from the press is a big help, and anything that's subscription based is good because it gives us like some solid future looking or income.
Yeah, absolutely. Super helpful. Um, if only I had. But actually, one really great example of this that happened in a very short space of time is the whole like South Asian Literature and Translation Initiative, right? I'm not going to get it right, but it's like Danny Han and Jason Grunbaum and others. And it's just been like what, like 2 years, 3 years, and I've seen so many like new translators and samples and like it's going to be weighted more towards books on the latter end. And was just like one person who had the funding and vision to make it happen in concert with these translators. So that's quite cool. Okay, and then close to last-ish question, I think is just like sort of your best tip for a person who's looking to break in, or like, what would you tell a person who's like thinking about, and this is also a question that's getting asked in different varieties, I think, in the chat, is like, I'm interested in translating this, I'm like interested in doing that. Like, what would you say to that person?
Don't be discouraged. Keep at it. I would also like generally recommend people through the university program. All the students in the grad program have to do a portfolio, and I make them, when I oversee them, make them do like a few different authors, a few different styles, like doing more that you can broadly, and is very helpful because you might find, oh, I'm really good at this particular type of writing or this particular author. I've got this voice down and I really like this, but I can't quite get there. Being able to try things out and have material that you can submit to magazines and to journals is really key because I mean, we do look at Words Without Borders. We look at like some of the different, like Arkansas International, like different Two Lines, different presses that have done like anthologies or magazines or journals, and like read through those and find authors that way. But being able to like get that experience, get those reps in on like how you get edited, how you revise, how your work is accepted, that's really key. And I think Kristen, I think you mentioned this, but like the kind of groups, getting into like one of the collectives, one of the groups, and having like, even if it's not a formal thing like that, having a few people that you can read your work to or who will read your work and give you feedback, I think that's really important too.
I think like there's a perceived scarcity problem in literary translation, and it's partly true. I mean, there's definitely not enough literature and translation being published, and thus I feel like there's just not enough work to go around. So some translators, they react to that by being very cagey about like sharing knowledge or sharing projects. I think, I always respect translators who can acknowledge like a valuable project and also acknowledge that they're not the right person for it. But I think, there are a lot of questions about like how I can reach out to editors, etc. But I would actually recommend reaching out to your fellow translators, especially if you're just, wanting to get, your foot through the door, because I think translators are one of the more generous communities among writer when it comes to sharing insight and knowledge with each other. I know many translators who would be very open to just getting, a cold email about like, look, I have this interesting project, or I just want to ask you some questions. And honestly, it's been said through this chat that we've been doing, like how swamped editors are, and I know I struggle to keep up with my inbox, but I think a lot of translators would be they're more readily available to get back to you about certain questions. So I would just keep that in mind, and also making connections, making friends, it never hurts. People do keep you in mind for things. So yeah, don't feel afraid about becoming a part of the community, even if it's early on for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm moderating, so I'm not going to talk a lot about my own experience, but like when I was starting to work on translations, I was a couple of years out of college, and I was living in London at the time, and I tried like a number of the things that people have mentioned so far, all at the same time. So like I went to the British Centre for Literary Translation summer school. I think there was a year when I thought, no, that seems like super expensive and very time consuming. And the second year I was like, oh heck. So I did that. I did one of the mentorships that are now run through the National Center for Writing with Howard Curtis. Um, I um, I had a project that I was really passionate about, and I submitted it for a Penheim grant, and it got one, and that made it much easier to submit it to publishers. What else did I do? I turned up for the first time at a conference of the American Literary Translators Association, knowing one person, a co-translator that I had worked on with one thing, and feeling a little bit shy, I suppose, because I'm in those situations, I'm an introvert. And then I left knowing I don't even know how many people. Um, I went to the London Book Fair through the mentorship and met a bunch of folks, and there met an editor who, sure, like commissioned me to do things, but also I think someone asked her at some other juncture, who would you recommend to do this book? And she suggested me, and it was the first translation that that was the first translation that I did. So yeah, so I think there's a little bit of like I'm going to let other people give advice as well, but I think there's a little bit of a combination of to the extent that you're able to, all of the above is a really great place to start. Whichever combination of it speaks to you, right? And there are things that I'm good at and things that I'm terrible at. So for instance, I am like terrible at pitching live to people, and I don't like going to like book fairs, but I have loads of friends who do. It really works for them, and they should keep doing it. Okay, other people.
No, I think that's absolutely right. You should do what you're comfortable doing because that will be your best. Like you can take Anton Her as an example, this prolific translator who's social media savvy he's just incredible. And that has helped build his own career. But there are many translators who don't want that. That's okay too. You just might need to take a different route. And that's okay too. You don't need to do all the publicity. It really does help, but it's also not, if that's not something that you can do, don't beat yourself up about it. You can still translate what you want to and what you love.
Yeah.
There are different ways to be a translators, I guess is what I'm saying.
Sarah, you get the final word, I think. If you've got something to say about this one.
It was mainly covered by the others, but yeah, I think very wise advice.
Yeah, well, thank you so much to everyone. Johnny, I see you're back on video, so
Yes,
over
this
to you
was
right.
wonderful. Since Kristen mentioned Anton Her, we did an event with Anton last summer. His debut English language novel came out, and his agent and editor and him sat down for a talk. So that was about that book, but he was very forthcoming about the translator's life, his whole history. So that's one thing to check out. Toward Eternity. You can search on the Authors Guild site or YouTube and find that. Otherwise, some people are asking about hiring translators. I know self-published authors in particular just want their book to be translated. And I would look at ALTA and similar orgs around the world. I think looking for literary translators, so you're not just hiring like a corporate translator, someone with that experience. And I think that's a great idea. But with that, thank you, Alexa, Kristen, Sarah, Chad, and Chenxin. This was amazing, and thank you to ALTA for helping put this together. We'll stay in touch, contact the Authors Guild, and look out for a follow-up email from me. I'll include some helpful links and resources in that. And with that,
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you.
so much,
Thanks, everyone.
everyone. Yeah, have a great rest of your day or evening.